Well, recently, one of my several hundred friends on Facebook posted a couple of videos by a fellow named Gary DeMar. Now, I should be quick to point out that despite my earlier comments about the random opinions of webcam jockeys out there in the internet world, that Gary DeMar is a respected author and theologian. I'm not lumping him into that previous group. Feel free to do a web search on the name Gary DeMar and go visit his American Vision website. The truth is, there's plenty there that I agree with. So I'm not taking issue with Gary personally at this moment. What I'm really arguing about is ideas. And he has jumped headlong into the middle of this controversy about the 1,000 years. So while I respect Gary's work in many areas, I'm still going to take issue with this particular video. Now, as I make this quick audio recording, I'm going to assume that you know some of this language, that you know essentially what premillennialism is versus amillennialism, or postmillennialism versus preterism. Well, when it comes to the question of eschatology, preterism and premillennialism are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Gary DeMar is a preterist. I'm premillennial, so that really does put us at opposite ends of the eschatological spectrum. The reason that I want to address this particular audio-video clip is that it's perfectly demonstrative of the technique that is used by every eschatological system other than premillennialism. It's an argument that says that the word 1,000 in Revelation 20 doesn't mean an actual literal mathematic 1,000 years, that it must mean something else. Now, here's a good general hermeneutic rule. If the words on the page do not mean what they say, in other words, if the original New Testament authors used any word that had a defined meaning, but they didn't mean to convey what the defined meaning of the word is, well, if the word on the page doesn't mean what it says, then we really have no way of knowing what it actually means. It's a really, really important principle. I really want you to wrap your brain around this for a moment. If the words on the page don't mean what they say, if we set aside their definition in favor of a new meaning, then there's absolutely no way to know what the actual meaning is. I'll give you an example. If I'm reading the Bible and I come across the word substitution, and I say to you, now, despite the fact that the word here says substitution, what it really means is, whatever I say after that, I'm making stuff up. Because the word substitution has a definition. And if I tell you that the word substitution means anything different than what the definition of the word is, then I have to be able to prove to you, without conjecture, without speculation, and not just so that I can support my particular hermeneutic or eschatological scheme, I have to be able to prove to you that the word substitution no longer means substitution. It now means something else. The problem, of course, is once we all agree that the word substitution does not mean substitution, we can never actually get to what it does mean, because what it does mean is going to bend under the opinion of each individual interpreter. And that leads to exegetical chaos. There's absolutely no way that we can understand anything in the Bible unless the words on the page convey the meaning that the original author intended to convey. So with that in mind, I'm flipping through Facebook, and my friend wrote, "Wow, once again an excellent short clip by Gary DeMar. There is little exegetical basis in the context of either Revelation 20 or Scripture as a whole to take the millennium to refer to a literal 1,000 years." That's his comment on the DeMar video. So let's listen to Gary DeMar for a moment, and then let's talk about the argument, because the argument he makes is typical of every argument I've ever heard that attempts to say that the 1,000 years of Revelation 20 are not meant to be taken literally. The next voice you hear will be Gary DeMar.
Revelation 20 is the foundational chapter for the dispensationalist on the millennial issue. And they maintain that the word 1,000 is used there. I believe they say it's used 6 times, and therefore it must be literal because it's used 6 times. Well, I would maintain that it's used 6 times, and it probably means the same thing all 6 times, whether it's symbolic or literal. So that really isn't a good argument. It's interesting that when you get to this generation is used like 20 times, and 19 of those times it refers to the generation of Jesus is speaking, but one time it means something different. And so here we find the dispensationalists kind of changing their literal method when they come to a passage that now seems to fit their system. The question is, does Revelation chapter 20 say what the dispensationalists need it to say? Revelation 20 doesn't say anything about a rebuilt temple, doesn't say anything about Jesus reigning on the earth during that 1,000-year period. Nothing is said about animal sacrifices. All the elements that are necessary for the dispensational system to work are not found in the very passage that they use to support their position. The use of the number 1,000 in Revelation chapter 20 is interesting because of the way 1,000 is used elsewhere in Scripture. 1 day in the court of the Lord is better than 1,000 days anywhere else. God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. God is faithful to his people for 1,000 generations. Well, what about 1,001 generations? Does God's faithfulness stop after just the 1,000th generation? Or does God own the cattle on 1,001st hill? Well, of course, God owns the cattle on all the hills, and God is faithful to all the generations through all time. And the same thing in Revelation chapter 20. Revelation chapter 20, and using that word 1,000, is telling us of the greatness and the magnitude of this reign of Christ. And by the way, that reign of Christ is in heaven, because the ones who reign with him are the ones who were beheaded. Therefore, they are dead, and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, this reign that takes place in heaven, I believe, is a directive for where the book, in fact, takes place. Because very early on in Revelation chapter 4, John is taken up into heaven. He sees this as a heavenly vision. And so we would expect that this 1,000-year reign of Christ with the departed souls would take place in heaven, where the rest of the book of Revelation is taking place in this visionary scene that John is given.
All right, let's review. My friend on Facebook wrote, "Once more an excellent clip by Gary DeMar. There's little exegetical basis in the context of either Revelation 20 or the Scripture as a whole to take the millennium to refer to a literal 1,000 years. The first thing I noticed when I listened to the Gary DeMar clip was that there was no exegesis. Proper exegesis requires that we understand the meaning of a word based on its definition, its context, its word usage, its historic word usage, and then whether or not it makes sense in its context. Can you read the original definition, the standard definition of a word, in the context you're reading it, and have it still make sense? If it does, there is simply no reason to assume a different meaning for the word. The question before us is the word 1,000 in Revelation 20 understandable on its face? Does it fit the context? And does its original meaning actually lead to a logical outcome? Well, the answer, of course, to all of those is yes. So the only reason to leap to the conclusion that the word 1,000 has a different meaning at this moment would be if you have a dog in this hunt, if you have some presupposition or some theological or eschatological system that you have to defend, and allowing the word to say what it says would upset your system. And sometimes that really dogged defense of a particular system ends up becoming little more than a denial of what the Bible actually says. So since there was no actual exegesis at work in this clip, let's walk through what Gary DeMar had to say bit by bit, and let's see if it makes sense biblically.